The debt question, we'll be looking at the foreign-domestic split. Of course, it's been on the rise over the last year. What we owe to different countries. Now, when President William Ruto took oath of office last September, the country's public debt stood at 8.7 trillion shillings. At the time, the debt ceiling was 10 trillion shillings. A year later, the country could have already broken through that ceiling, even though official figures from the Central Bank of Kenya go up to April this year that put public debt at 9.6 trillion shillings. Now, broken down a year ago, the split between domestic and foreign debt was almost 50-50. That ratio is slightly distorted, with external debt taking about 52% at 5.1 trillion shillings. Now, let's talk about the countries we owe most. Out of the 5.1 trillion shilling external debt, 1.2 trillion shillings are through bilateral loans, meaning country-to-country loans. Well, China leads with 70% at 856 billion shillings, and that's followed by France and Japan and, of course, Germany. Now, in terms of debt currency, much of the external debt is in the form of foreign currency. Nearly 67% of those loans are dollar-denominated, meaning every time the dollar gains against the Kenya shilling, the country's foreign debt becomes more expensive with equal proportion. Nearly 21% of the loans are euro-denominated, followed by the Chinese yuan at 5.4%. Now, speaking of foreign currency, the Kenya shilling has lost to the dollar by more than 20 points. A day after Ruto's inauguration last year, the dollar was exchanging at 120 shillings, very hard to believe, to the Kenyan currency. Earlier this week, the dollar was exchanging at 145 shillings, according to the CBK rates. So, Ruto's inaugural fiscal budget plans is to spend 3.68 trillion shillings. Out of this, the government hopes to collect revenues of up to 2.92 trillion shillings. Now, after the grants a target of 42 billion shillings, the government has a budget deficit of 718 billion shillings, one of the lowest deficits for the last few years. Now, something changed, and this was between June and August. You're about to see. When National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Professor Njuguna Ndung'u read the budget in mid-June, the government decided that the 586 billion shillings of the deficit was to be financed from domestic borrowing. Now, CBK Governor Dr. Kamau Thuge later announced that the Treasury had a change of plans, moving 270 billion shillings to the external borrowing target. As a result, 402 billion shillings will be borrowed from the external market, drifting away from the president's stance to reduce on external loans. Now, to conclude on this, let's focus on some of the key economic indicators, and that is the inflation rate. Now, when President Ruto took oath of office, inflation was at a record high of 9.1%. In July this year, it had dropped to 7.3%, having experienced a spike in the months of October and November last year. Now, according to CBK statistics from August this year, the overall inflation had dropped to 6.7%, and this was attributed to the dropping prices of food. Now, for food inflation in September last year, it was 15.5%, but has now come down to 8.6%. And the worst affected inflation has been, of course, fuel, with the increase in prices and the higher VAT on the commodity, which Ruto's administration moved from 8% back to 16%, and that was in July. So fuel inflation has moved from 11.7% in September last year to 14.5% this July. And this is a look at the public debt and some key economic indicators. Of course, all of this courtesy of our numbers guy, in-house numbers guy, Sam Gituku.
Yeah, Sam Gituku always crunches the numbers, but I tell you what you were saying earlier on, Vicky, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Indeed, indeed. Something that we're definitely watching over the next couple of months.
Absolutely.